Hello and welcome to this screencast of our mini lecture on adolescent literacy and culturally relevant pedagogy. The slides to this actual PowerPoint are available right on the course D2L at the link underneath this video. These slides were made with Google presentations, so everything that you see on the slide you can access in terms of if there are live links. You can just click on the links that are on the slide and they will take you there for more information about those links, etc. So we'll go ahead and get started. So basically, I'm just kind of doing an overview of some of the concepts of adolescent literacy. It's not a summary of the readings per se, but just some other ideas that relate to the readings and extensions so that you can think about how the readings fit into a larger perspective. So some of the key concepts to think about, like if I'm trying to focus you on the many things that will be discussed, is the idea of adolescent literacy. You want to leave the discussion or leave the mini lecture having a sense of what adolescent literacy is and its unique situation. And then some responses to that, which are participatory culture and culturally relevant pedagogy and multimodal composition. So first off, it's often said that teenagers never read, but actually teenagers do read quite a bit. They just don't necessarily read what adults want them to read. In fact, this study that looked specifically at the reading habits of urban teens found that urban teens read quite a bit as well. In fact, 72% of urban teens reported that they read leisurely quite often. However, what differs between urban teens and suburban rural teens is what urban teens read. And if you look at the preferred leisure reading items underneath there, so urban teens tend to read primarily magazines and comics leisurely, where more suburban and rural teens tend to have more books and internet as their preferred leisure reading. So there's a difference in what is read. But teens do read. Urban, suburban, and rural teens do read, despite what they say about teens not reading. They just may be reading in different spaces and online and in different things. So of those, but when looking at urban teens, we do have to consider that urban teens are not reading that much during the weekends and during the summer. So, and that is where sometimes there is a slide in terms of reading comprehension. So there's a lot of reasons why there isn't as much reading that's happening during the summer in terms of access to books, activities that students are involved in, etc. But that slide during the summer when there's not much reading happening can lead to a three-month fallback in terms of reading comprehension levels. So just something to take into consideration in thinking about teens and their reading. Also, another thing to consider is everything that's happening in the teen brain. So you've probably heard often that toddlers are having a neural explosion in their brain when they're going through the toddler ages. Well, teens as well are having a neural explosion. There's lots of neurons being formed and growing. However, a little bit distinct from toddlers is that there is a huge increase of myelin. And myelin is I guess you could say the liquid or substance that coats the nerves, which increases their connectivity and their speed, etc. So with this increased myelin happening, you have increased connectivity of ideas across topics, increased creativity, increased adaptability. So there is actually many benefits to this amazing teen brain that's happening, besides what every other people might say in terms of like, oh, the teen brain, all it is a mass of hormones. Really, it's much more complex than that. So there's actually increased capabilities. With that, however, comes increased risk-taking as well. Although there's increased myelin, there is not as developed of a frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe doesn't finish developing until the late teens, early 20s, and that can be even later, oftentimes for males. And the frontal lobe is often associated with executive function and foresight and really being able to assess the consequences of actions. So it's not just that teens are making bad decisions. In many ways, their brain is not even fully developed in that area. So these are some things to consider as we're developing our curriculum. It's not that they don't care about our discipline and don't see the value of the scientific method or being able to read academic writing. It's just that really they might not, their brain might not be able to fully envision and think about what that means. So a lot of people talk about the adolescent reading crisis, and I put that in quotes because yes, there's a crisis of sorts, but there's a lot of crisis and inflammatory discussion that happens around this. So I just want to break this down a little bit. So the National Assessment of Education Progress Test, also known as the NAEP, has recently come out. It happens every few years. And yes, eighth graders, which is the beginning of when we start thinking of secondary reading, eighth graders are reading, two-thirds of them are reading at or below basic reading levels. And that is of concern, especially when you consider that those gaps between are vary much more when looking at ethnicity, with African American and Hispanic eighth graders and older performing even at lower averages. So in thinking about this adolescent crisis, yes, there are achievement gaps based on ethnicity, and they persist. So something is not addressing these gaps that we need to think about. The PISA, which is an international version of the NAEP, also finds that 15-year-olds, American 15-year-olds in particular, perform lower on reading assessments than compared to other developed countries. So another cause for concern that many feel. And then while younger readers, 9 years old and younger, so like fourth graders and under, are improving in their reading performance. However, adolescent readers are not. So something is amiss. The reading instruction that's happening in elementary grades is helping readers develop, but the reading instruction, or perhaps lack of reading instruction, that's happening in secondary years is not helping. And so there's been some responses to this. There's been the Common Core. That's why the Common Core has much emphasis on reading, not only within English, but across the disciplines, because as this course will hopefully make evident, reading is very different depending on what discipline you're in. So you can't just teach one type of reading and then they have it figured out. And so that's why also the disciplinary literacies movement has come up and arose. And frankly, that's why the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction has required this course for everybody to read, to look at, so we can read about how reading is different at the secondary level. What we're asking students to do is different than what we're asking students to do in terms of reading in the elementary years. So while there is this crisis, and if I could show you air quotes while I'm saying this, I would do that now. While there is this crisis that's happening in adolescent literacy, there's also this renaissance, or maybe not renaissance, but this flourishing of adolescent literacies happening online. Adolescents are reading online, they are writing online, they are composing online at record rates. So it isn't as if adolescents do not have literacy and are not literate. It's just happening in different spaces and using different tools. And so one of the concepts that has come up to help understand this is this notion of participatory cultures. And to help us understand how spaces online are different and why they promote reading and writing in different ways than school spaces. And so this list here just goes over some of those characteristics of online participatory spaces. And so these are things to consider when designing our curriculum and delivering or inviting students into the content of our disciplines. While the goal is not to turn school into Facebook, there are some things to be learned from this. So this is how NCTE, which is National Council of Teachers of English, which has taken kind of a lead on looking at this more advanced form of reading and writing that happens in the secondary years. This is their summary of elements that that helps us understand adolescent literacy. And so to summarize those, there is a tension. There is a tension when it comes to thinking about adolescent literacy, and adolescent literacy is very much defined by this tension. So at one side, adolescents are being required to do more complex tasks in the secondary grades, and they're reading and encountering more complex texts. So they're being asked to do more with more difficult texts. So that's one pull that they're experiencing. At the same time, personally, adolescents are increasing in their interest in themselves and in figuring out how they are placed and positioned in the world. And therefore their interest in school is oftentimes diminishing. Not that they're not interested in the social activities going on at school, or the sports going at school, or the theater going on at school, all these other activities that help them figure out who they are, but there's a conflict going on in terms of what they're being demanded and expected to do versus what their existential interests are pulling them to do. So that tension, those opposing pulls, is very characteristic of the adolescent literacy experience. So there have been a few responses to this tension, this pull. And one of them is culturally relevant pedagogy. And so you may have heard about this in other classes. If not, you can click on this link and it'll take you to, we're learning some more about it. Gloria Ladson-Billings, teaching in Madison, actually coined the term, but it has been taken and extended from so many other people. In fact, the two videos I had you watch for this week, the Chris Emdin video, Reality Pedagogy, and the Chris Emdin video on hip hop in the science classroom, are actually different manifestations of this idea of culturally relevant pedagogy, of really thinking about how to connect and bridge the content that you want to teach to the many talents and diverse intricacies of the student body in your classroom. So learning does not just happen by opening up a brain and pouring it in. You always have to think about your audience. And so culturally relevant pedagogy is really trying to approach that. And I think that Emdin's discussion of reality pedagogy really tries to open up some of our missteps in the past as we've tried to look at culturally relevant pedagogy as in the case of multicultural education, just trying to have diverse texts. It's not just about having diverse texts. It's really about looking at the way one is as they teach, the way one approaches their content, etc. Going a little bit more into that, Ladson-Billings describes culturally relevant pedagogy as a way of being that informs doing. So it's not just our content and making sure that we choose diverse texts, but it's really an ongoing way of looking at who we are as educators, always continually trying to figure out who our students are, and continually rebuilding that bridge between our students and our content. So it's always a constant challenge on our brain to be creative, which is one of the reasons hopefully some of you have come to education, to be creative, to think about your love for your content and how you can open that up and invite others. One of the ways we're going to directly address that in this class is with the concept of one of the ways we are going to address culturally relevant pedagogy is through the component of multicultural relevant content. And so one of the big assignments that we'll be doing for this semester with your digital inquiry blog or your disciplinary inquiry blog is to curate or select a group of texts about a topic in your discipline that you would teach to students. And of those texts, some of those will need to be culturally relevant in that they are connecting in some way with your students, either their ethnicity or their culture as their own distinct culture as adolescents, because adolescence in itself has its own culture, its own values, its own practices. So you're going to, in choosing your text, you're going to want to think of something that is culturally relevant to the adolescent experience or the specific ethnicities of your students and language diversity of your students, etc. And one approach to do that is to think about multimodal composition. So much of what happens in participatory culture online is composing multimodally. And what that means is basically composing with images, sound, movement, etc., bringing in all these other components besides just print. Print is a part of that, print text, but also all these other components. And so oftentimes schools tend to be very print-centric, and really academic literacies are very print-centric. However, how might we build a bridge bringing in more multimodal expression to help students take on more of that print-centric expression? So that is some of the things that we're going to be exploring. You'll be collecting multimodal text as well in your text set. And you'll be doing quite a bit of multimodal composition for your digital inquiry blog, hence why it's being hosted on a blog. So these are some things to think about as you go forward with the semester when thinking about adolescent literacy. You really want to think about embracing multimodal composition as an approach to culturally relevant pedagogy. Think about how you deliver your content. Think about how you invite students to engage with your content. Think about the different genres or types of text that students can produce to show you that they understand their content. This is going to be a big approach to us addressing the unique needs of adolescent learners, and especially when thinking about urban adolescent learners as well, when we think about the texts that urban learners tend to prefer as well. So as we go forward, feel free to ask me any questions about these concepts, but I hope this gives you a better idea as you go into not only this discussion activities for this week, but also in selecting your text going forward throughout the semester.